24 April 1943, San Francisco. 11,000 men of the 7th Infantry Division steam out of the fair spring weather of California and head toward a far less hospitable landfall on the Japanese-held island of Attu. Westernmost of the strategically crucial Aleutian Island chain, Attu is the first target in the U.S. attempt to wrest the entire chain from Japanese control. Japanese intelligence determines the Americans' intentions, and on 7 May, the day originally planned for the invasion of Attu, the garrisons of Japanese on the island stand prepared to repel an attack that never comes. Due to inclement weather, U.S. planners have chosen to postpone the attack. Instead, American ships spend the day playing cat and mouse with the Japanese Navy. On 11 May, the Americans finally attack, catching the Japanese somewhat off guard. Having seen neither hide nor hair of the invaders, the Japanese stood down on 9 May, allowing the Americans to take the beaches standing up. By the 12th, the soldiers of the Rising Sun find their feet and mount an impressive defense. The Green Americans are at a distinct disadvantage, not only because the Japanese are so firmly entrenched, but also because they are unaccustomed to the unpredictable weather of the North Pacific. The Japanese stationed there are used to the bitter cold and rain. Despite this, in the weeks that follow, the men of the 7th adjust to the miserable climate, and by sheer force of numbers, succeed in driving across the island. Early on the morning of 29 May, Colonel Yasuo Yamakaze sends his remaining troops in a final desperate charge against the Americans. By daybreak, however, the battle is over and Attu belongs to the U.S. Some 600 Americans have been put to rest in this desolate land as a result of this first Aleutian offensive. Despite the American victory, the rest of the islands remain under Japanese control, promising a long and bloody battle. As terrible as the American casualties are, the losses sustained by the Japanese approach the unbelievable. Of the 2,400 soldiers stationed on Attu, only 28 allowed themselves to be taken prisoner, the rest having fought to the death. In the face of such resolve, an invasion of the next step in the Aleutian chain, the island of Kiska, seems even more daunting. 12 May 1943, Washington, D.C. For the second time this year, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill, along with their top military advisors, gather to try to plot the future of combined English and American operations. At the meeting in Casablanca this past January, a great deal was left undecided. In fact, one of the few things that was certain as the meeting concluded was that the gap between the two factions was growing wider with each passing week. As the two groups go through the formalities of opening statements and picture-taking, the distrust between them is palpable. Churchill and Roosevelt, choosing to remain diplomatically aloof, dispatched their respective chiefs of staff to wrestle with the details and report back. As the days pass, the negotiations are marked by thinly veiled disdain and anger. While both sides share the same goal, ending the war as quickly as possible, there is deep disagreement on how to achieve that goal. At their first meeting, the U.S. commanders had agreed that the Allies should focus on defeating the Nazis before turning their attention to the Japanese. Subsequently, however, they came to realize that allowing the Rising Sun to romp unchecked across the Pacific until the war with Germany reached its conclusion would be disastrous, and they began diverting men and materiel to the Far East. The British, on the other hand, are somewhat indignant that the Americans are not abiding by their agreement. They insist that the Allies, having driven the Germans from North Africa, should cross the Mediterranean and drive up through Italy and southern France, striking the Reich at its weakest point, forcing them to move troops away from northwest Europe and the Russian front. In addition, Churchill and his commanders are all for delaying a cross-channel invasion indefinitely until success is a certainty. The Americans, on the other hand, believe any delay of the invasion will only prolong the war in Europe. Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General George Marshall, has been pushing hard for such an offensive to take place before the end of 1943. As the conference drags on, the meetings grow longer and tempers grow shorter until, on the morning of 19 May, with the participants becoming openly hostile, Marshall suggests they go off the record and speak their minds. Marshall's idea works. With the conferees able to speak openly, the air is cleared and an understanding is reached. By that evening, they are able to deliver a draft of their conclusions to Churchill and Roosevelt. It is agreed that there will be an invasion of Sicily, but that only those forces already in the Mediterranean will be involved. It is further agreed that on 1st November, 7 divisions of the Mediterranean force will be moved to England to begin preparing for a cross-channel invasion, now being called Operation Overlord, to take place on 1st May 1944. The conference continues for several more days, finally drawing to a close on 25 May. And while several other decisions come out of the discussions, it is Sicily and Overlord that are of the greatest import. It is these that will allow the Allies to move forward in unity. Both sides agree that should they in the future reach an impasse, they will once again go off the record, clear the air, and move on. 6 May 1943, in what is surely the opening of the final act of World War II in Africa, the Allies attack along a narrow front south of the Tunisian capital. After months of divisive backbiting, the British First Army and the American Second Corps are at last working side by side. To the right, the Americans, commanded by General Omar Bradley. To the left, the British First, commanded by General Kenneth Anderson. Bradley orders the American 1st Armored Division forward against Germans dug into a line of low hills between the towns of Matur and Ferryville. Bradley knows the attack will be costly, but reasons that surrounding the Germans will be worth the loss. Progress is indeed slow. The Germans, as usual, have booby-trapped and mined the ground they give, and as engineers clear a path for the troops to follow, German artillery pummels the American armored columns. As the 1st Armored moves slowly through the hills, the 1st Infantry executes a bold and arguably foolhardy maneuver. General Terry Allen, commander of the Big Red One, ordered by Bradley to establish a defensive perimeter at the base of the hills, instead attacks. The German Barentine Regiment, battle-hardened and bitter after a string of hard-fought defeats, counterattacks. The Americans take hundreds of unnecessary casualties, and the normally taciturn Bradley vents his frustrations on Allen, ordering him not to risk his men without reason again. To the left of the Second Corps, the British are slogging along the road to Tunis. The British armor faces off with the remnants of Germany's once great Africa Corps, but in less than 24 hours, the British have the road cleared. The British 1st Armored and the American Red Bull Division link up and enter Tunis. General Sir Harold Alexander gives the order for the combined force to strike out for Bizerte, the last remaining German stronghold. Already on the outskirts of Bizerte is the American 9th Infantry Division. Accompanied by a ragtag band of French troops, the 9th is bogged down in a morass of German minefields and booby traps only 12 miles from the city limits. Still smarting from Alexander's previous attempts to shut Americans out of the march to victory, Bradley orders the 9th to move forward even if it has to walk single file through the minefields. By 1500 hours on 7 May, Major General Manton Eddy signals Bradley that the road to Bizerte is wide open. Within an hour, his half-tracks are roaming the streets of the town. With resistance in both Tunis and Bizerte collapsing, Adolf Hitler orders his commander, General Jürgen von Arnim, to continue fighting to the last bullet, Von Arnim, taking Hitler's message to heart, races eastward out of Tunis toward the Cape Bon Peninsula. The British 6th Armored gives chase and on 9 May splits the last remnant of Hitler's once mighty African army into small, ineffective groups. On 12 May, the last 7 tanks of the 10th Panzer Division follow Hitler's orders and fire off their final rounds of ammunition. With those rounds gone, Von Arnim surrenders. In the Tunisian campaign, Axis forces suffered more than 40,000 casualties. The Allies more than 65,000. But North Africa is at peace. The war, in this one place, is at last over. May 1943, a delegation led by Winston Churchill arrives at Maison Blanche Airport in Algiers for talks with the Allied Supreme Commander in the Mediterranean, Dwight Eisenhower. As a measure of how important the meeting is to Churchill, he ordered the pilot to fly his C-54 non-stop from North America to Gibraltar, the first time that had been attempted, and then on to North Africa. The meeting is far from spur of the moment. The fighting in North Africa is over, and with preparations for an assault on Italy getting underway, Churchill wants to iron out details of the Allied invasion. Churchill makes it clear from the outset that his primary concern is progress on the Russian front. The Red Army is pushing steadily forward, and it is on that front that Churchill believes the war will ultimately be won or lost. Churchill explains to Eisenhower that the main role of the American and British armies is to draw Axis strength from east to west. Eisenhower presents his plan for the invasion of Italy, tentatively scheduled to take place in 6 weeks. Churchill reminds Ike that if the invasion goes well and Sicily is quickly conquered, the Germans will not be forced to divert assets from the east. Eisenhower promises that if Sicily falls quickly, he will proceed immediately to the Italian mainland, denying Hitler the battlefield quiet that would allow him to turn his full attention to the Russians. On 31 May, British Foreign Minister Anthony Eden arrives in Algiers, bringing with him the question of what exactly to do with Charles de Gaulle. The leader of the Free French, de Gaulle lacks a significant army, navy, or air force, but still demands to be included in practically all aspects of the war. Churchill and Ike agree to grant de Gaulle power of governance over former French holdings in North Africa. On the afternoon of 4 June, Churchill and his party slip out of Algiers, heading for London. The heavy lifting of winning the war remains, as Churchill prefers, with the Russians. But though the Prime Minister sees Italy as a sideshow, to Eisenhower and the thousands of troops under his command, the invasion of Sicily and the subsequent invasion of Italy will be anything but a distraction. June 1943, Rabaul, New Britain. 120 Japanese fighters and dive bombers take off to strike Guadalcanal. A raid follows 2 in the previous week, which cost the Japanese dearly. But Admiral Mainichi Koga, recently promoted to commander of the combined fleet, is determined to successfully fill the shoes of his predecessor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, by halting the American drive westward. Once again, as in previous raids, the Japanese planes are spotted en route by Australian coast watchers who immediately warn Henderson Field of the impending attack. As the Japanese approach Guadalcanal, they are met by swarms of American fighters determined to keep them from reaching their target. The green Japanese pilots, while flying planes that are capable enough, lack the experience to challenge the veteran pilots of Henderson Field effectively. The Americans chalk up victory after victory as the Japanese try desperately to break through the air cover to strike cargo ships off the coast of the island. Those who do manage to elude the defenders find themselves jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire as they are met by a barrage of anti-aircraft from below. Despite the hailstorm of flak, the Japanese do manage to hit 3 cargo ships, one of which is forced to beach itself off Laguna Point to avoid sinking. The price the Japanese are forced to pay, however, is unacceptable, even to the most rigid commanders. The loss of 98 planes prompts them to call off any further daytime raids against Guadalcanal. Elsewhere in the Pacific, the Americans are preparing the next attack in their march to Japan. American commanders realize that before a further westward drive will be possible, the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul must be neutralized. To do this, they must climb the steps of the Solomon Ladder from Guadalcanal in the east to New Britain at the far western end. The next rung on the ladder after Guadalcanal is the island of New Georgia. A newly constructed Japanese airbase at Munda on the island will provide an excellent staging point for raids against Rabaul. The Americans realize an amphibious assault against Munda will be impossible due to a large coral reef and extensive enemy shore batteries. The target, instead, is to be the island of Rendova, 6 miles off the coast. From there, heavy artillery can be brought to bear on the Munda garrison. On 30 June, elements of the Army's 43rd Division go ashore on Rendova. Infantry-supported armored units make quick work of the small Japanese garrison, and the engineers get to work constructing a road through a 6-mile stretch of jungle to the point from which the artillery can fire on Munda. Although the men of the 43rd face no real resistance on the ground, they are subjected to murderous attacks from the air. In their first 2 days on the island, 30 men are killed and over 200 wounded by marauding Japanese fighters and dive bombers. By the 3rd, however, the road is complete, and the artillery goes to work pounding Munda. As the bombardment gets underway, 2 regiments of the 43rd go ashore at Zanana, New Georgia, some 5 miles northeast of Munda. The plan is to quickly push through the jungle and attack Munda with support from the big guns on Rendova. But there is a problem. What looked like an easy 5 miles on maps is, in fact, an impossibly thick jungle. As the Americans hack their way through the heavy undergrowth, the Japanese, using guerrilla tactics, strike at the advancing column and then disappear into the jungle, shouting obscenities at the frustrated GIs. Heavy equipment bogs down in the mud, and the men are forced to unload supplies and carry them forward on their backs. The drive slows, and the morale of the men begins to plummet. By the 9th, after suffering a full week in the dense jungle, fighting an enemy they can seldom see, many of the men are completely unnerved. By the evening of the 9th, Admiral Bull Halsey, disgusted at the lack of progress, dispatches Major General Oscar Griswold to take command of the offensive. Upon arriving, he informs Halsey that 2 more divisions will be needed before Munda can be taken, and the 25th and 37th Divisions are sent to join the fray. Once again, as on Guadalcanal, the Americans are being bloodied by an enemy they far outnumber. An operation that was supposed to be over quickly and require no more than 1 division has become a costly stalemate, tying up 3 full divisions. The Americans, buoyed by their victory on Guadalcanal, seem to have forgotten the ferociousness of the enemy they faced there. The soldiers of the rising sun are now jarring their memory, reminding them that it will be a long, costly drive across the Pacific. June 1943, New Guinea, a joint force of American and Australian troops land at Nassau Bay on the island's northeast coast, south of the Japanese naval bases at Salamaua and Lae. The attack, Designed to coincide with Admiral Bull Halsey's advances in the Solomons is the resumption of General Douglas MacArthur's drive through the Southwest Pacific toward Japan. The operation, known as Cartwheel, is getting underway only after a bitter dispute between MacArthur and American naval commanders. Following the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, MacArthur presented the Joint Chiefs with Operation Elkton, his ambitious plan for a 5-stage advance up the coast of New Guinea and across to Rabaul. The plan was rigorously opposed by Admiral Ernest King of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He did not want the fleet to be subject to MacArthur's command and felt the whole thing was simply a plot to siphon strength from the Navy's planned Central Pacific drive through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. Infuriated, MacArthur accused the Navy of denying him the forces necessary to win the war before the end of the year. He angrily informed Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General George Marshall, that the campaign in New Guinea was being temporarily suspended due to lack of resources. Tied to the agreement with Britain limiting offensive actions in the Pacific, Marshall simply lacked the men and equipment to fully supply both MacArthur's plan and a Central Pacific campaign. After vigorous and sometimes heated discussion, a compromise was reached. MacArthur was forced to scale back the scope of Elkton, and in return he was given temporary control of Halsey's battleships, carriers, and cruisers. Out of this compromise, Operation Cartwheel was born. Now, with Halsey's forces in the Solomons fighting for New Georgia and MacArthur on the move in New Guinea, Japanese commanders are beginning to have grave concerns about Rabaul. The Americans, having spent 4 months mired in inter-service squabbling, seem to have quelled the dispute and are now working in concert to isolate and destroy this vital Japanese bastion in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur, too, believes the matter has been largely settled. Although he was forced to scale back his grand plan, he believes that with the addition of Halsey's fleet to his command, the Joint Chiefs have endorsed his Southwest Pacific campaign as the primary focus of the drive on Japan and relegated the Navy's Central Pacific offensive to a mere supporting role. Admiral King, however, has other plans. He has been closely watching operations in the Solomons and New Guinea and has begun to doubt the wisdom of fighting the Japanese on the large jungle-ridden islands of the South Pacific. Disease, infections, and supply problems continue to sap the strength of fighting units, making progress both slow and costly. He believes that the volcanic and coral atolls of the Central Pacific are a much better prospect. Relatively small in size and void of the maladies inherent to the jungle, these atolls could be taken by a much smaller force in a shorter period of time. Whether MacArthur or King will prevail remains to be seen, but one thing is certain. The Americans are once again on the move in the Pacific. And with their emerging dominance of both the sea and air, it seems only a matter of time before they set foot on the shores of Japan. July 1943, the Russian front. After a night filled with the whine of artillery shells and the drone of bombers, German troops numbering some 700,000 along with 2,400 tanks and assault guns begin pushing both north and south at the base of a salient 118 miles wide and 75 miles deep. Their objective is the city of Kursk. While Kursk holds no particular military value, Hitler has ordered this operation purely as a spectacle, hoping to gain one last victory in the East that will, as he puts it, shine like a beacon around the world. While many of his military advisors discouraged him from this offensive, just as many saw that it was politically necessary. So it is that after months of planning, the Nazis are once again on the offensive in Russia. Only this time, Joseph Stalin is prepared. Starting with the Russian counteroffensive at Stalingrad, both sides in this conflict have, time and again, used a pincers movement to cut a salient off at the root, trapping whole armies in the process. But both Stalin and Hitler have, in essence, been looking at the same map, and both can see the bulge in the lines. Even though the Nazis have been falling steadily back, Stalin suspected that Hitler would not be able to resist trying to spring one last trap. So he has placed a huge reserve of men and tanks east of Kursk. Now it appears as though his caution will pay dividends. Attacking from the north, the German Ninth Army under General Walter Mödel begins pushing toward the village of Olkhovatka, about a third of the way to Kursk. They make good progress. By the night of the 6th, they have pushed 13 miles and are closing in on the village. However, the Russians strike back, bringing their reserve tank divisions into the fray and turning it into a battle of attrition. The Soviets have the numbers on their side, and by 9 July, Mödel is reporting that a breakthrough to Kursk is unlikely. In the south, the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hart is having a better time of it as they advance toward the town of Oboyan, about halfway to Kursk. Despite their preparations, the Soviets are surprised when Hart attacks from the west side of the Donets River, and in the first 2 days he is able to drive forward 13 miles along a 25-mile front. By 12 July, the 700 tanks of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps have advanced to within 22 miles of Oboyan and are moving along a corridor only a few miles wide near the banks of the Paisal River when they run headfirst into the 800 tanks of the Russian 5th Guards Tank Army. In minutes, battle lines dissolve as tanks from both sides charge. Before long, confusion reigns supreme and the air is filled with the smoke of burning armor. As the combatants withdraw, the battlefield is covered with more than 500 battered and burning tanks. Despite having been held back, Hart's forces have inflicted more punishment than they have taken, and he is sure that a second assault will carry the day for the Nazis. However, it is not to be. Upon returning to his headquarters, Hart receives a message from Berlin. The British and Americans landing on Sicily 2 days earlier have now broken out of their beachheads, and Hitler insists that he must have the 2nd SS Panzer Corps for the defense of Italy. As a result, he has canceled the advance on Kursk and ordered all elements to withdraw to their starting positions. And so, it seems that 90,000 Germans and even more Russians have been killed or maimed for no real reason at all. The truth be told, the whole offensive was designed to do nothing more than put a gleam in Hitler's eye. But now it seems all the more useless, for there will be no decisive outcome, no ground or advantage or stature gained by either side. What has been the largest tank battle of this or any other war has been merely an exercise in death, destruction, and a tyrant's whim. 10 July 1943, the largest armada in history, more than 3,300 ships, arrives off the southern tip of the Italian island of Sicily. Aboard those ships are 7 Allied divisions and the logistical support that the Allies hope will make possible the conquest of the largest island in the Mediterranean. The amphibious force has been gathering for more than a month. It has moved quietly out of ports in North Africa, with supply ships coming from as far as England. A few ships one night, a few more the next, trying to preserve secrecy while heading always to this moment. Awaiting this Allied invasion are more than 200,000 Italian Army regulars and 30,000 Germans. It is a sizable force, but the one thing no one seems sure of is how effective the Italians will be. American intelligence, after interviewing Italians captured in Africa and reviewing reports from Sicilian operatives, is convinced that Mussolini's army would rather switch than fight, and predicts an easy campaign. The plan is strategically simple. The British Eighth Army, led by General Bernard Montgomery, will lead the attack, moving north up the eastern shore of the island. The U.S. 7th Army, led by General George Patton, will land to Montgomery's left, protecting the British flank and, in Patton's mind, facing the brunt of an Axis counterattack. The invasion is codenamed Operation Husky, and the shipboard forces are preceded only by a relatively small number of airborne troops. But high winds and dark clouds conspire to render the airborne attack useless. More than 3,000 American paratroops land scattered across the island in concentrations too weak to be effective, and the British can place only 12 of more than 140 gliders on target. The few soldiers who survive the landings uninjured are quickly rounded up by Italian patrols. That same weather churns the normally placid Mediterranean. Within sight of Sicily, the ships begin to disgorge their cargo of seasick infantry, many of whom have been bobbing around offshore for more than 2 weeks. The U.S. 7th Army arrives on schedule at the coastal towns of Gela, Licata, and Scoglieti. And though the landings themselves go smoothly, the troops meet a stiff line of resistance a quarter-mile inland, Italian armor. Contrary to intelligence, the Italians do not surrender. They fight. Patton, leading a force of 3 infantry divisions, is a tank commander without tanks of his own. But his infantry improvises well and is able to drive the Italian armor back. To the east, Montgomery, as Patton had predicted, faces only light resistance. He plows through to Syracuse before the Nazis can get more troops to the scene. Hitler, managing the war from the safety of Berlin, has his own doubts about the Italian commitment to his Reich and sends in reinforcements, eventually totaling more than 50,000 men. The German reinforcements slow the push north. The British probe the Germans for a soft spot but find nothing. On 11 July, the Luftwaffe arrives in force, bombing and strafing not just the British, but also the thousands of landing craft supplying the invasion. Gunners on the beach, blinded by magnesium flares and pummeled by the Luftwaffe, open fire on anything in the air, tragically attacking a flight of American C-47s carrying units of the 82nd Airborne Division. Before the firing is brought under control, 23 American aircraft are downed by friendly fire. The quick victory predicted by intelligence is not to be. It becomes clear early on that Sicily will be no easy conquest. What is just as clear, and in the long run perhaps more disturbing, is that the Allies have on their hands the beginnings of a first-class rivalry. Patton's disrespect for Montgomery is becoming obvious to their troops. Rather than waiting for Monty to fight his way out from under the Germans, Patton plows gleefully ahead, stretching the bounds of his orders in his quest to best his British counterpart. Montgomery, no less full of himself than Patton, has his forces looking desperately for a way past the Germans so that he might be the one to claim the island for the Allies. That Patton and Monty will let their distaste for each other continue to affect their battle conduct seems inevitable. The only question that remains is whether the competition will help or hinder the Allied war effort. As the war moves now from Africa to Europe, the logistical challenges faced by the Allies change dramatically. Left behind is the Sahara Desert, an area largely devoid of natural features. The desert has mountains, of course, but they tend toward the Runti. And though there are riverbeds, they stay perpetually dry. Africa, for the soldiers who fought there, was a clean slate, a battlefield that exerted a very limited effect on the battle. Europe is different. Europe has rivers that actually flow, mountains that tower to the clouds, features that can stop an army in its tracks even without the presence of an enemy. In North Africa, the work of combat engineers was largely unappreciated. They built their share of berms and revetments. They smoothed out roads, ran wires and the odd pipeline across the barren landscape. But the battle seldom, if ever, turned on their labors. As the Allies expand their beachhead in Sicily, however, it is becoming clear that the engineers are no longer going to remain secondary to the other military specialties. Sicily, like Europe as a whole, is hilly, an island of roads that cling to hard rock cliffs above valleys cleaved by broad streams. A retreating force to delay an advancing enemy need not fight. It needs simply to destroy bridges and roadways. That is, not surprisingly, exactly what the Germans and Italians are doing. It is the job of the combat engineers to rebuild those bridges and roads, to keep the columns moving forward or sideways or whatever direction their commanders deem necessary. The engineers arrive at a bottleneck well prepared. They have most often studied aerial photographs of the blown bridge, photographs taken long before infantry and armor arrive on the scene. They bring with them the tools of their trade. They have Bailey bridges, temporary and transportable spans that can be increased in length and capacity simply by bolting piers and trusses together. They have at their disposal as well pontoon bridges, which float on the water and seem about to sink with every passing vehicle. But often as not, the engineers build their bridges out of what they find around them, including pieces of the old, destroyed bridge. It is a bromide among engineers that the perfect combat bridge will collapse as soon as the unit's last vehicle crosses it. That would mean, the engineers say, that they had fulfilled their mission, getting the unit across without spending a single unnecessary minute on the bridge. The combat engineer's goal is not, after all, to build a bridge for the ages. It is to get their particular unit across the barrier as quickly as possible. The engineers would, of course, prefer to work under cover of darkness. But they work when there is work to be done. And if progress can best be made in the daylight, then in the daylight they will work. So it was in the Sicilian hills not long after the invasion of the island. With the Allies moving steadily northward in coordinated columns, an entire American brigade came around a bend on a mountain road, only to discover that the road came to an abrupt halt. Brought to the fore with artillery echoing through the hills, the engineers went to work. They blasted away the rubble of the old roadway, forming a secure base for their new fabrication, and began immediately bridging the remaining gap. This kind of work is not for the faint-hearted. Directions are shouted, plans improvised on the spot. In a matter of only a couple of hours, there is a bridge where none had previously stood. It is made of wood and sweat and ingenuity, strong enough stuff that the commanding officer leaps into his jeep, orders his column forward, and crosses the bridge without first sending a test vehicle. That is, to the engineers, the greatest compliment. The war in Europe will be vastly different than the war already won in Africa. It is a war that has just begun for the combat engineers, as it has for the other soldiers, with one job finished and 1,000 more like it yet to come. July 1943, Rome. As the Allies continue to advance on the island of Sicily, and the Nazis reply with a flood of reinforcements, the Italian High Command circulates a memorandum declaring that the Axis cause there is lost. A flurry of confidential communiques follows the Italian memo. On 15 July, General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht's operations staff, makes it clear to all around him that he believes the fall of Sicily to be imminent. 3 days later, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini cables Hitler that he, too, thinks that Sicily is lost. Hitler, of course, is enraged by Mussolini's whining and declares that the Luftwaffe and his own racially superior troops will prevail where the inferior Italians failed. As Axis recriminations fly, the fighting on Sicily continues. By 18 July, the basic Allied strategy is clear. General George S. Patton and his American 7th Army drive northwest toward the city of Palermo, entrenching themselves as they go and dividing the island along a north-south line. On the other hand, General Bernard Montgomery and the British 8th Army are heading straight north toward Messina, the town closest to the Italian mainland. The Allied strategy is a compromise worked out by General Dwight Eisenhower, and it is guaranteed to keep no one happy. Montgomery had wanted Patton's army to protect his left flank as he drove north. Patton, on the other hand, wanted to drive to Palermo without slowing down to hold positions in the largely barren center of the island. To Patton, it seemed as if the bulk of his force's time would be spent rounding up straggling Italian prisoners of war, while Montgomery reaped the glory of conquering the island. Patton's feelings are no secret. When British General Sir Harold Alexander, Patton's boss, sends orders commanding the Americans to take Petralia, a small and, Patton believes, insignificant town 45 miles southeast of Palermo, the orders somehow never make it through to the general. Instead, they are sidetracked, allowing the 7th Army to continue forward. In the meantime, the British are having trouble getting around Mount Etna, the volcano that dominates eastern Sicily. Montgomery is, as always, cautious. The Germans are dug into the haunches of Etna, as well as the surrounding hills, and though Montgomery's troops have encircled the enemy, they cannot dislodge him. On the morning of 19 July, the Americans launched their final assault on Palermo. The fight quickly turns into an engineering war, with Germans and Italians blowing bridges and booby-trapping roadways. By 22 July, the 3rd Infantry has taken up positions along the Belice River, southwest of Palermo. As they prepare for battle, they are stunned to hear that the Italians in control of the city have decided not to fight, but to surrender. Patton enters the city with all the pomp of a conquering potentate. He sets up his headquarters in a palace, inviting reporters in to hear of his exploits. Montgomery, on the other hand, remains bogged down at Mount Etna. On 23 July, General Alexander grudgingly admits that Monty and his 8th Army aren't going to break through without some help. He orders Patton and the Americans toward Messina. Patton, whose troops are tired from weeks of forced marches and battle, is thrilled. It is, he tells those around him, a final admission by the arrogant Brits that it is the Americans who have come to their rescue. The Nazi forces that have confounded Montgomery will now face not one, but 2 Allied armies, making it clear to all, even to Hitler himself, that the Axis cause on Sicily is all but lost. With that in mind, on 24 July, Italy's fascist Grand Council meets. Unhappy with Mussolini's tepid response to Hitler's belittling of Italian troops, and distraught at rapid Allied progress on Sicily, the Grand Council removes Mussolini from power. He is imprisoned at the Pagora Carabinieri barracks and allowed no contact with the outside world. The announcement of his resignation brings Italians out into the streets where they dance late into the night. Mussolini's successor, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, affirms the Italian intent to continue the fight against the Allies. But on 31 July, he sends emissaries to Lisbon, Portugal, to talk peace with the British. Clearly, the rapid progress on Sicily, which made so obvious so early the inevitability of the Allied conquest, now has implications far beyond the island's rocky hills. The war in Europe has changed. The Americans and British have now, in effect, opened the second front the Russians have so long been pushing for, and Hitler has lost his closest ally. All this, and the island has yet to fall. July 1943, Guadalcanal. A force of 192 bombers and fighters leave Henderson Field to strike the Japanese-held island of Bougainville. The largest island in the Solomon chain, Bougainville is the last major obstacle facing Admiral Bull Halsey in his quest to climb the Solomon Ladder and isolate the Japanese naval air station at Rabaul, New Britain. Although the fighting still rages on New Georgia, Halsey is looking ahead. He knows that before troops can land on Bougainville, the island's 6 airfields must be put out of commission, and the flow of Japanese reinforcements stop. At Buin Harbor, the first planes of Halsey's strike force find tons of Japanese shipping sitting helplessly at anchor, utterly defenseless against the marauding B-24s. By the time the Japanese gather their wits and launch fighters to confront the liberators, a second wave, this time dive and torpedo bombers, is homing in on its targets. As the Zeros climb desperately to gain altitude, they are pounced upon by the covering force of Navy Corsairs, who continue to add to the toll they have taken on the Emperor's reserve of experienced pilots. As the strike force turns for home, they have destroyed at least 21 Zeros and leave behind 7 burning ships, including 3 destroyers. While Admiral Halsey and the American High Command may be turning their attention to Bougainville, it is the last thing on the minds of the men struggling to survive in the jungles of New Georgia. The GIs and Marines fighting here face a determined enemy in the troops of Major General Nabuo Sasaki. Well camouflaged in a maze of pillboxes, they subject the Americans to withering machine gun and mortar fire. The jungle is incredibly thick and offers every advantage to a clever defender. For the men advancing into the teeth of these defenses, it seems as though they are fighting an invisible enemy. Progress is measured in feet. On 26 September, however, things begin to move. Marines, supported by light tanks, begin to gain ground on a hill known as Bartley Ridge. Firing at point-blank range, the tanks push forward through the Japanese defensive positions. The fighting is vicious and slow-going. The result, at the end of the day, is 14 pillboxes destroyed and 200 bloody yards of Bartley Ridge in American hands. By 1st August, the constant artillery and aerial bombardment has taken its toll on the Japanese. Still, they continue to fight in desperate stands, determined to die gloriously for their emperor. By the 5th, however, Munda is secure, and General Griswold radios news of the victory to Admiral Halsey. He receives the typically gruff reply, "Keep them dying." Although Munda is now in American hands, it has been a far tougher fight than expected. An operation that was supposed to last no more than 2 weeks and take no more than a division has taken 5 weeks and 3 times as many men. It is becoming increasingly clear to American commanders that they desperately need to change their strategy. Slugging it out with every entrenched Japanese division in the Pacific could take a decade and come at a cost of lives the American public would be unwilling to accept. But for now, they will take their victory and look ahead to the next step in the drive to Japan. August 1943, Libya. The crews of 178 heavy bombers of the 9th American Army Air Force prepare for a 7.5-hour journey to attack the German-occupied city of Ploiești in Romania. Located in the foothills of the Transylvanian Alps, Ploiești serves as one of the most important sources for all of Germany's petroleum needs, and without it, Germany's mechanized war machine will surely grind to a halt. Called Tidal Wave, the second raid on Ploiești is directed at the city's massive oil refineries. The first strike, launched on 11 June 1942, was wholly unsuccessful. Indeed, the main result of that raid was an increase in German anti-aircraft defenses in the area. 50,000 German troops and several hundred anti-aircraft guns are now located in and around the city. Unfortunately for the bomber crews, Allied intelligence has failed to accurately appraise Ploiești's increased anti-aircraft capabilities, and as a result, planners have devised tactics for attacking a lightly defended target. The approach to Ploiești varies from the Allied bombing tactics in use over Germany. The bombers over Hamburg and Essen released their loads from an altitude of several thousand feet in an effort to avoid anti-aircraft fire, while those at Ploiești are to be released from below 100 feet. This technique should yield remarkably accurate bomb placement. The mission is plagued with problems from the start, with one of the bombers having crashed on takeoff and several others turning back due to mechanical difficulties. Over the Mediterranean, the plane carrying the assault's lead navigator crashes into the sea, leaving the force in the hands of a less experienced navigator. Approaching Ploiești, Mission Commander General Uțel Ent, mistrusting the replacement navigator, mistakenly directs the liberators toward the city of Bucharest, 35 miles south of the target. Even after realizing their navigational error, the pilots are too busy avoiding flak to immediately correct their heading. Once on approach to Ploiești, the B-24s encounter their stiffest resistance yet. Undaunted, the pilots sweep in low to drop their bombs as precisely as possible. The increase in accuracy, however, comes at the price of increased exposure, not only to enemy fire, but also shrapnel from explosions on the ground. As a result, many bombers are blown from the sky. Those following the first wave find their job complicated by the dense smoke rising from the burning oil. And those planes which survive the fiery gauntlet intact fly straight into a swarm of waiting German fighters. Fighting past the Luftwaffe, many of the surviving crews land safely in Malta, Sicily, Cyprus, and Turkey, while others limp just far enough away to crash and sink into the Mediterranean. By the end of the mission, the Air Force counts 579 men dead, wounded, captured, or missing. As the people of Ploiești spend 2 August fighting fires and diverting their oil production to undamaged refineries, it seems that tidal wave's impact is going to be short-term at best. While the limited damage to Ploiești may necessitate further airstrikes, the sacrifices made on this mission may help save lives in future efforts to destroy Hitler's oil. What is more important, perhaps, is the inspiration, the emotional lift their actions provide for those actively engaged in the war, as well as those on the home front. The bravery and self-sacrifice exhibited by these men, who flew into a flaming, bullet-ridden hell, knowing full well they might never fly out of it, stands as a symbol of their fighting spirit, and will shine like a beacon of hope for those at home as well as their brothers in arms. August 1943, the Russian front. The Red Army, having recently repelled the German offensive known as Operation Citadel, in which Hitler had hoped to retake the city of Kursk, completes its triumph by executing a counteroffensive and driving the Wehrmacht from the city of Orel. In Moscow, the normally stone-faced Stalin allows himself the indulgence of a smile. The reason for his glee is not just the victories at Kursk and Orel, but his belief that the momentum has shifted permanently to the Soviets. When it became clear that the Allies were in a position to overrun Sicily, Der Fuhrer ordered the troops around Kursk to withdraw to their original positions and prepare for the transfer of all SS Panzer divisions to Italy. It is just this sort of relief that Joseph Stalin has been demanding since he entered into his uneasy alliance with England and America. While the people of all of the United Nations have suffered in this war, clearly it is the Russians who have borne the brunt of the misery. And until now, there has been little effort on the part of Russia's allies to alleviate that suffering. When the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa on 22 June 1941, the Soviet people were taken totally off guard. The German advance was swift and, as always, merciless. Soviet cities toppled like dominoes. Brest, Smolensk, Riga, Kiev, and with it much of the Ukraine. Leningrad was surrounded, beginning a siege in which hundreds of thousands of people died of starvation. By December of 1941, the Nazis had battled to the outskirts of Moscow, almost literally to the doorstep of the Kremlin. Only then were the men of the Red Army, assisted by the harsh Russian winter, able to bring the advance to a halt. Stalin, knowing that his country and his people were suffering much greater losses than the other Allied nations, demanded that the U.S. and Britain mount a cross-channel attack in 1942. Opening a second front in Western Europe would force Hitler to draw troops away from the Russian front and ease the suffering of his people. The United States was interested in pursuing the possibilities, but Churchill would have none of it. The results, he insisted, would be disastrous. The loss of life too great to bear. Stalin found this position outrageous, convinced that for every British life saved, a Russian life would be lost. The debate continued until the ill-fated raid at Dieppe in August of 1942 served to prove Churchill's point. In the spring of 1943, the Nazis once again went on the offensive, and once again the Russians suffered. The Red Army proved no match for the Wehrmacht. The losses, both military and civilian, were enormous. As winter approached, however, the determination and fortitude of the Russian people began to pay off. The Germans were soundly defeated at Stalingrad. The siege at Leningrad, if not broken, was at least breached. The Red Army began to push forward all across the front. Then, as summer arrived, there was some effort by the U.S. and Britain to come to the aid of the Soviets. On 10 July, Allied troops came ashore on Sicily, and the impact was immediate. With the Americans and British poised to strike at Italy, Adolf Hitler suddenly had two fronts to worry about, and on 13 July, the Kursk offensive was canceled. German troops and equipment began to move away from the Russian front. Now, as they marched through Orel and beyond, even the Russian soldiers on the front lines are beginning to believe that their fortunes have changed permanently. And while Stalin is pleased, or as pleased as Stalin can get, at the relief he is getting, he cannot help believing that it has been much too long in coming. The Russian people have suffered and died to preserve American and British lives. He continues to demand a cross-channel invasion, certain that until his allies plant their feet on the beaches of Western Europe, it is his country, his people, who will continue to pay the price. August 1943, Sicily. The American 7th Army, led by General George S. Patton, pushes along the north coast of Sicily toward the town of Messina. For Patton, the push is a journey of personal triumph, the writing of history by a general who believes himself destined for greatness. Patton's destiny is being fulfilled by the American 45th, and 1st Infantry Divisions. As Patton rides in parades and issues daring commands, it is the infantry who must slug it out with the Germans. To Patton's east, the British 8th Army, under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, is bogged down in the hills around Mount Etna. They face a vast array of German-laid minefields and booby traps. Clearance of the obstacles is virtually impossible, as the Germans rain artillery fire down on the exposed engineers. Patton is, of course, intensely aware of Monty's progress, or lack of it. Since meeting in North Africa, Patton and Monty, despite their positions as Allied generals, have become bitter rivals. There are many reasons for this, most of them having to do with the petty jealousies that so often distract men of great ego. Each general believes his own country superior. Each believes the other to be incompetent. And each wants for himself credit for winning the war. Patton and Monty answer to British Field Marshal Harold Alexander, who, as commander of ground forces in North Africa, came to believe that Americans were sloppy, undisciplined soldiers. In fact, early in the American deployment, they were just that. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower's answer to that problem was Patton, a disciplinarian of the First Order who quickly whipped the Americans into shape. Alexander, however, never really got over his fundamental distrust of the Americans' ability and seemed uniformly to favor his British countrymen, particularly Montgomery. Patton bristled at every perceived British slight and condescension, and by the time the Allies landed on Sicily, he was near the point of open mutiny. Once again, Alexander had planned the battle so that Monty would enjoy the glory and Patton endure the real work. Once again, entreaties to Eisenhower were answered with diplomatic compromises that Patton didn't like and Alexander largely gutted. A student of history, Patton knew that the key to taking Sicily is Messina, the city closest to the Italian mainland. In Alexander's plan, Monty ended up assigned a straight shot at Messina, while Patton was relegated to fighting the long way around the island and guarding the British flank. Now, however, Patton is in a position to arrive first at Messina, claiming his role as hero while vindicating once and for all the American fighting man. Patton urges his troops onward, and the men of the Big Red 1 and 45th Infantry claw slowly forward, battling through enemy minefields, past blown bridges, every obstacle a potential ambush. The casualties are not horrendous, but they are constant. Brave men, Patton calls his soldiers, but on 3 August, while visiting wounded at a hospital near Nicosia, he is confronted with something else entirely: battle fatigue. Outraged that an enlisted man who left battle merely for psychological reasons would be housed with soldiers physically wounded, Patton curses a quaking private, slapping him and throwing him out of the hospital tent. On 5 August, Patton issues an order to all battle commanders that no more cases of battle fatigue are to be treated in hospitals under his command. Those who report for stress-related treatment, Patton says, should be court-martialed. It is an inhumane order. One of the well-kept secrets of the war is that the stress of fighting can cause as many casualties as bullets. As the 7th Army moves closer to Messina, the German resistance stiffens. General Omar Bradley conceives a series of amphibious landings behind enemy lines, leapfrogging the Nazis' entrenched positions. On 7 August, Bradley launches the first assault, hitting hard and forcing the defenders to abandon their positions. The main German force, however, escapes. On 10 August, with the second landing underway, Patton, clearly in a frenzy over the taking of Messina, stops at another hospital to visit another group of his brave men. Among them, he finds another case of battle fatigue. He slaps the soldier repeatedly before leaving to monitor Bradley's progress. The final push into Messina goes well. The city is isolated, and on 16 August, Bradley makes plans to have Major General Lucian Truscott, Jr., whose 3rd Division did much of the actual fighting, accept the city's surrender. On 17 August, however, Truscott stands by fuming as Patton leads the parade into the city. Patton enters the city convinced that he is at last triumphant. But in Algiers, Eisenhower receives his first reports of the soldier-slapping incidents. Ike, whose respect for Patton's abilities on the battlefield is essentially boundless, nonetheless decides that Patton needs a jacking up. He orders Patton to apologize not just to the soldiers involved, but to the hospital staffs that had witnessed the events. Patton does so, and apologizes to Eisenhower as well for causing him grief and difficulty. Back home, press reports of the incidents create a groundswell of sentiment for Patton's expulsion from the Army. Eisenhower, however, understands the brash tank commander's value to the war effort and has no intention of losing him for good. Still, there is little doubt that Patton's future is clouded. August 1943, New Georgia. Although his units are still holding out against the overwhelming American force driving on Munda, Major General Nabor Sasaki, realizing a defeat is inevitable, has already begun to withdraw his remaining forces to the island of Kolombangara. Here, northwest of New Georgia, he has constructed an even stronger defense than the Americans faced at Munda. With an airfield and 10,000 troops at his disposal, Sasaki is determined to stop any American attack in its tracks. As on Guadalcanal, the U.S. Navy is taking a heavy toll of the barges used to shuttle reinforcements to the island. PT boats armed with torpedoes, cannons, and 5-inch rockets terrorize Japanese shipping and shore installations day and night. These attacks are not without a price. One of the fast attack boats, PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, is sliced into by a Japanese destroyer in the dark of night. Kennedy and 9 surviving crewmen swim 4 hours in a dark sea to the nearest island where they are rescued by natives. The growing force on Kolombangara poses a difficult problem for Admiral Bull Halsey. His half of Operation Cartwheel, the 2-pronged drive to neutralize Rabaul, is nearly a month behind schedule. He is, as he says, wary of another slugging match. Looking for alternatives, he turns to Admiral Kincaid's strategy in the Aleutian Island campaign. Jump over the enemy's strong points, blockade them, and leave them to starve. Halsey knows that if he uses this strategy, he must have an airfield. Reconnaissance reports indicate that the island of Vella La Vella, next up the Solomon Ladder after Kolombangara, is lightly defended and offers at least one airstrip. Halsey's decision is made, and the invasion of Vella La Vella is set for 15 August. Over the next 2 weeks, the Navy continues to run roughshod over Japanese shipping. On 6 August alone, they sink 3 destroyers, sending over 900 of the Emperor's best soldiers to a watery grave. On the morning of 15 August, 2 battalions of the 25th Division land on the beaches of Vella La Vella. Resistance on the ground is light, and Japanese fighters that try to disrupt the landings are quickly driven off by Marine flyers and corsairs. By the morning of the 16th, the GIs are driving inland, and Seabees are busy repairing and expanding the airfield. General Sasaki, caught completely off guard by the landings, desperately tries to reinforce the island, but the Americans have a hold on Vella La Vella and have no intention of letting go. With this bold stroke, Halsey has rendered Kolombangara useless at little cost to his own forces. American commanders are elated. They have avoided what surely would have been a long, costly battle and moved another step up the Solomon Ladder with almost no opposition. Perhaps more important, they have found a new strategy to employ against the Japanese, one that, if it continues to succeed, could dramatically shorten the war in the Pacific. August 1943, England. After waiting a full hour and a half for the skies to clear, the commander of the 4th Wing of the 8th Air Force, Colonel Curtis LeMay, decides he can wait no longer and orders that the day's mission begin. The plan will require precision, as 3 different bomber wings and several fighter squadrons, all coming from separate English airfields, are to be used almost simultaneously in the raid. LeMay's 4th Wing is to rendezvous with its fighter escort on the way to Regensburg, bomb the factory, and then fly on to Africa. Scheduled to coincide with the attack on Regensburg is a diversionary attack by the RAF on German airfields along the coast. Slated to cross into German airspace just 10 minutes after the bombers of the 4th are 230 flying fortresses of General Robert Williams' 1st Air Wing. They are to proceed to Schweinfurt to bomb ball-bearing plants before turning back toward England. Thanks largely to his highly disciplined training regimen, none of the 147 B-17s under LeMay's command encounter any difficulties taking off in Britain's notorious pea soup fog. Flying on instruments, the bombers are soon safely en route for the German Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. Unfortunately, the fog in which LeMay's men are so capable either grounds or delays all of the other squadrons. The first fighters that the men of the 4th Sea aren't escorts, but Luftwaffe defenders. Determined to bring down the forts, they fly through their own flak to get at the big bombers. The diversionary attacks along the coast arrive far too late to divert any attention from the raid at Regensburg. Despite sustaining heavy losses, LeMay and his men stay on course and deliver their payloads. Those who survive the German flak and fighters fly on to land in Africa with little more than fumes in their gas tanks. Meanwhile, the 1st Wing crosses into Germany a full 5 hours late, met by only half their allotted number of escorts. Unfortunately, the light resistance expected is anything but light. Luftwaffe commanders, hoping to intercept LeMay's bombers returning to England, have sent up every available fighter, as luck would have it, directly into the flight path of the 1st. By the time the bombers reach Schweinfurt, the Luftwaffe has downed over 30 fortresses. Frustrating matters further, the factories in Schweinfurt are spread far apart and shrouded in artificial smoke. Their numbers depleted, the men of the 1st turned toward England only to be greeted by fresh Luftwaffe fighters who had been on the ground refueling. Luckily, a group of P-47 Thunderbolts arrived to escort the battered bombers out of Germany. They lose only 1 additional fort and down 11 Luftwaffe fighters. While the raid on Regensburg causes major damage to the plane factory, most of the bombs in Schweinfurt miss their mark. The fact that the largest and most complex raid yet attempted by the American Air Force in England has been foiled by the caprices of weather demands reconsideration of the tactics underlying the entire bombing campaign against Germany. As ball bearings in Schweinfurt continue to roll off the production lines, Allied commanders are left to wonder if the damage to the Nazi war machine is worth the price paid by the men of the 8th Air Force. August 1943, Moscow. After years of gloom and defeat, the Russian people, dancing and cheering, take to the streets in celebration. The reason for this revelry, which was ordered by Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, is to commemorate the Red Army's taking of Kharkov in the Donets River basin. The Soviet people, hungry for any good news after years of hardship and grief, don't have to be ordered to rejoice. Although this is the 4th time Kharkov has changed hands since the beginning of hostilities, Stalin is comfortable issuing orders for a celebration, for this time the Germans are unlikely to return. Not only has the Red Army managed to turn the tide through blood, sweat, and sheer force of will, Stalin knows that the impending invasion of Italy by the U.S. and England is forcing Hitler to divert men and resources to the West. So, despite orders from Hitler to the contrary, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein has withdrawn his battle-weary troops from Kharkov in order to avoid a repeat of the disaster at Stalingrad. While the people of Moscow celebrate the Red Army's conquest, there is little to celebrate in Kharkov itself. Intent on leaving nothing of use for their enemies, the Nazis have conducted scorched earth withdrawals each time the city has changed hands. Buildings and bridges have been blown up, factories destroyed, homes set to the torch. By the time Russian troops arrive, Kharkov is little more than a shell of a city. The soldiers of the Red Army have little time to dwell on the destruction. All along the southern half of the front, the Russians continue to press, smashing into the German lines and forcing continued retreat. The Nazis, determined to punish the Russians for having the gall to liberate their own country, step up their scorched earth practices, destroying nearly everything they leave behind, whether it is of military value or not. Silos, houses, haystacks, grain fields, everything is blown up or burned, leaving tens of thousands homeless and hungry. Russian soldiers moving through this wasteland find their already intense hatred of the Germans rising, fueling the ferocity of their attacks. Under increasing pressure from the Soviet offensive, the Wehrmacht continues to fall back. On 9 September, an enraged Hitler flies to von Manstein's headquarters in Zaporozhye to demand an explanation for his continued withdrawals. Hitler is concerned that if von Manstein cannot thwart the Russian advances, Germany will lose control of the Donets River basin and all its mineral resources. It takes a week of stating and restating the obvious, but von Manstein finally manages to convince the Führer that he has two choices: either withdraw from the Donetsk region or sacrifice thousands of men and tons of equipment being driven out. Reluctantly, the Nazi leader agrees to allow continued withdrawals. It is decided that von Manstein's troops should stage a fighting retreat to the Dnieper River and set up a defensive line. With the withdrawals now officially sanctioned, von Manstein begins pulling his men out of harm's way in earnest. Russian advances come swiftly, and German-held cities begin to fall like dominoes. Barankovo, Volnovakha, and Chaplino fall on the 10th. On the 12th, the German 17th Army begins withdrawing from the Kuban bridgehead into Crimea. On the 14th, they begin a fighting retreat from Bryansk, which falls 3 days later. On the 18th, the Soviets, pushing toward Kiev, take Prilupki, Lubny, and Ramadan. While further south, Pavlograd, Krasnograd, Pologi, and Nogaisk all fall into Russian hands. On 25 September, a triumphant Red Army marches into Smolensk, until recently a major Nazi stronghold. For Stalin and the Russian people, it is the culmination of a month filled with victories, beginning at Kharkov and ending here. In that time, Red Army troops have advanced nearly 150 miles along a 650-mile stretch of the front. Still, this is no time to ease the pressure. Stalin and his men have the Germans on the run, but the Soviet premier knows all too well how quickly the tide will turn if he allows von Manstein and Hitler a chance to regroup. So he will continue to push his men to attack, night and day, regardless of the weather, sometimes beyond reason. Together, they will anoint the soil of their homeland with German blood until they have driven the Nazis out of Mother Russia and all the way back to Berlin. August 1943, Great Britain. As the men of the American 8th Air Force return to their air bases after a day of bombing German manufacturing facilities at Regensburg and Schweinfurt, their English counterparts take to the sky. The British flyers have been told that they are en route to destroy an advanced German radar research facility. In fact, the RAF is launching an attack against what looks frighteningly like the future of Nazi warfare, the German Rocket Research Center at Peenemünde. Though Peenemünde has been in use since the 30s, it It has recently received increasing interest from both the Axis and Allies. With the exception of Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Munitions, most of the German High Command had discounted the usefulness of rockets in war. But in the past year, important changes have taken place. In response to Allied successes in bombing German cities like Hamburg and Essen, Hitler has requested the development of vengeance weapons with which to strike back at England. On 3 October 1942, the V-2 rocket was successfully tested, flying over 100 miles and striking within a few kilometers of its target. While not pinpoint accurate, the V-2 is undoubtedly precise enough to strike major metropolitan targets, precise enough in Hitler's mind to bring England to its knees. Thus, Werner von Braun, the brilliant director of research at Peenemünde, has recently found favor with the Fuhrer, and his rockets enjoy all the benefits of being Hitler's pet project. Spies posing as workers at Peenemünde have kept the Allies informed of the progress of the V-2 and its little brother, the V-1. As their development and production gear up, it is decided to launch a bombing raid, dubbed Operation Hydra, against Peenemünde. The plan takes its name from the multi-headed dragon of mythology. While the main assault will be directed toward Peenemünde, a second squadron will fork off in a feint toward Berlin, 115 miles south. As on many nights before, Mosquito bombers enter German airspace en route to Berlin. However, this time they are outfitted with special equipment, which gives them the appearance of greater numbers in the enemy's radar. The 20 planes attract enough attention that over 200 night fighters are sent to confront the attackers. They arrive in time to see just a handful of the Mosquitoes, already beginning their return to England. Meanwhile, the first wave of bombers arrives over the rocket facility unmolested and drops incendiary bombs to light the way for the planes which follow. As the second wave approaches, Luftwaffe fighters arrive and launch a counter-assault which downs 40 bombers. Those who survive return to England secure in the knowledge that many more lives would have been lost had the diversionary raid on Berlin not been so effective. As the fires at Peenemünde are extinguished on 18 August, toll is taken of the havoc wrought by the RAF. The damage to the V-1 and V-2 programs is relatively minor, as critical launch sites and blueprints have escaped unscathed. 2 rocket scientists and 730 construction workers, among them Allied spies, have been killed in the bombing. Lost also is the illusion of secrecy under which everyone at Peenemünde had believed they worked. The Allies have struck at the Nazi vengeance weapons before their violent introduction to the world, before even one has been used. For September 1943, New Guinea, as Admiral Bull Halsey's forces continue their advance through the Solomons, troops under the command of General Douglas MacArthur prepare to launch the next phase of their offensive to drive the Japanese from the north coast of New Guinea. The target of the offensive is the Huon Peninsula, specifically the Japanese strongholds of Lae and Salamaua. These bases will provide a staging point for an assault across the Dampier Straits to New Britain. Although today is the day the Australian 9th and American 41st Divisions under the command of Major General G.F. Wooten are to go ashore 20 miles east of Lae, preparations for the invasion began in June when Allied forces landed south of Salamaua at Nassau Bay. Those landings had exactly the effect MacArthur had intended. Japanese commanders, believing that Salamaua was the Allies' primary objective, began to move troops south from Lae to reinforce the garrison there. Although only a feint, this force has been steadily pushing the Japanese back. They now are within 6 miles of Salamaua. The next critical blow was delivered on 17 August when bombers of General George Kenney's 5th Air Force strike the Japanese airbase at Wewak. The force stationed there was to provide air cover for the garrisons at Lai and Salamaua, but the raid caught the Japanese off guard and the planes were destroyed on the ground. This raid has become known as the Black Day to the Japanese, whose air strength in New Guinea was virtually wiped out. Now, as the landing operations at Lai get underway, it becomes quickly apparent to MacArthur how well his deception has worked. The Japanese have so weakened their garrison at Lai that by nightfall, the Allies have landed almost 3,000 troops and hundreds of tons of supplies with very few casualties. On the morning of the 5th, the other shoe drops on the Japanese. Following an intense low-level bombardment by B-25 Mitchells and A-20 Havocs, the men of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment launch an airborne assault against Nodzab Airfield, about 18 miles northwest of Lai. MacArthur, flying aboard a B-17, proudly watches the war's first strategic deployment of an American airborne unit. The Japanese are caught completely off guard, and the men of the 503rd secure the field virtually unopposed. They quickly set up a perimeter and set about repairing the airfield. 2 days later, elements of the Australian 7th Division under the command of Major General George Vasey land in C-47s and begin pushing toward Lai. Japanese Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, stunned that Allied forces are suddenly advancing on him from 3 sides, is determined to stand in Salamaua and fight to the death. The Japanese High Command, however, unwilling to sacrifice the force, orders him to withdraw if it becomes evident he will be overrun by the Allies. On 11 September, he orders his remaining forces to retreat toward Lai. Also racing for Lai are the men of the 7th and 9th Divisions. While their commanding generals have wagered that each would reach the city first, for the men, it is quite simply a matter of pride. Mud and rain-swollen rivers present more of an obstacle than Japanese resistance, and both forces make good progress. On 16 September, the men of the 7th enter the shattered city and claim their empty prize. The main body of the Japanese 18th Army, some 9,000 men, have abandoned the city and escaped to the mountains north of Lai. There is little time for self-congratulatory pats on the back. MacArthur, determined to keep the pressure on, orders the men of the 7th to do an about-face and race back toward Nodzab and the Ramu Valley. The 9th Division is to push up the coast to the Huon Peninsula and launch an assault on Finschhofen. For the Japanese commanders, it seems as though the walls are beginning to crumble around them. MacArthur is rolling through their defenses on the Huon Peninsula, and the new strategy of island hopping has propelled Admiral Bull Halsey's forces up the Solomon Ladder with alarming speed. They see the overwhelming number of ships, planes, guns, and men the United States is bringing to bear, and fear that eventually this growing power will eclipse the rising sun. September 1943, Salerno, Italy. Just hours after the Italian surrender is announced over the wireless, men and equipment under the command of Lieutenant General Mark Clark are discharged from ships into the Bay of Salerno. The operation is codenamed Avalanche, a name that characterizes not only the operation's objective, but the Allies' self-assurance as well. Like the uncontrollable force of nature for which it is named, American and British troops will descend upon and hopefully bury the Nazis. Situated 35 miles southwest of Naples, Salerno is merely a stopping point in this landslide. With speed and surprise as the tactics, the plan imitates its title. However, 6 weeks of negotiations for the Italian surrender have bogged down Allied momentum and provided the Nazis time to prepare. Following the Casablanca Conference in January, the Allies declared that nothing short of unconditional surrender would be accepted from any of its enemies. The Italians, however, appeared not to have heard about Casablanca. Although Italy's new government, under the leadership of Pietro Badoglio, was perfectly willing to yield to the Allies, it also had certain conditions under which it would do so. Fearing Nazis stationed in Rome would react violently to news of a capitulation, Italy haggled for British and American protection of the Eternal City. While squabbling with the Allies, Badoglio also pandered to Hitler, telling him that their fascist union was insoluble. Hitler, however, considered Badoglio a spineless waste. His attention was focused instead on the Americans and British. Sensing Italy's impending betrayal, Hitler used the time provided by the dragging negotiations to stock Italy with his own forces. Finally, Allied commanders delivered an ultimatum to the Italians: surrender unconditionally or Rome would be mercilessly bombed. Badoglio, who favored neither the political doctrines of the Axis or the Allies, unconditionally surrendered on 3 September. Then, fearing German reprisals, he and Italian King Victor Emmanuel fled immediately to Brindisi. Despite the fact Italy is still swarming with Nazis, the Allied outlook is as high as the Alps. British commanders are predicting that the war will be over in a year. But German Field Marshal Albrecht Kesselring has very different ideas. He intends to contest the taking of each inch of Italy and has prepared his troops to do so. The Nazis easily overtake Italian defenses at Salerno. Huddled in dry machine gun nests high above the invasion zone, the Germans drive the Allies back into the chin-deep waters of the bay. Scores of men never again touch land, and those who do find themselves on a shallow beachhead trying to fight their way uphill, a motion not usually associated with an avalanche. Speed is no longer a factor in this operation. Soldiers are barely able to maneuver through the remains of their fallen comrades. Landing craft find they can't lower their ramps due to the buildup of dead bodies. For 2 days, the Germans fire on the men of Avalanche. The Allies make minor gains by taking a nearby airstrip, but even this small victory is negated when shells from German panzer units pound the strip into rubble. British troops under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, who are supposed to drive from the south and join with Clark's forces, instead remain mired at the rainy tip of Italy. Allied commanders have no answers to the Nazi pounding. Their forces are divided by Kesselring's troops. The beachheads won in the first days of the operation are now lost, and it seems as if Avalanche will subside into the sea. By 12 September, the Allies' situation is desperate. Both the British and the Americans have no reserves left, and every man capable of carrying a rifle is already fighting. On 15 September, help finally arrives as 3,500 men of the U.S. 82nd Airborne drift down like snowflakes, bringing much-needed reinforcement to the beleaguered Avalanche. With the support of 2 additional British battleships and a massive increase in air support, the battle quickly turns in favor of the Allies. By the next day, the Germans realize they cannot hold and decide a change of tactics is in order. They draw back to new defensive positions, digging into the hills around Naples, preparing themselves to meet the victorious, albeit somewhat humbled, British and American forces. In Tokyo, within sight of the Japanese Imperial Palace, there is an institution as sacred to the Japanese fighting man as the emperor is to the Japanese nation as a whole. It is Ichigaya, the Japanese equivalent of America's West Point. As much shrine as it is educational institution, it is the spiritual center of a Japanese military that is, in many ways, trapped astride the 19th and 20th centuries. Opened by imperial edict in 1877, Ichigaya is charged with developing not only the military's leadership, but also with preserving the historic traditions of Japan's military past. Of its first graduating class, all but 3 were samurai. Even today, with the most modern of wars being waged, much of that samurai tradition remains. Those who make it to Ichigaya are the cream of each year's crop of students. In Japan today, there is no career more honorable than the military, and families seeking the best for their sons enroll them in military schools by the time they reach age 14. It is these families' fervent hope that they will make it to Ichigaya. Only a fraction of a percent of those who begin down this long road will complete the journey. Standards throughout the Japanese educational system are high and rigidly enforced. Students are subject to a constant winnowing. Those who do not meet expectations are allowed to stay in the military, but they will not be eligible to rise to the highest levels of command. Students at Ichigaya are never allowed to forget their responsibilities to Japan. Their days start early and run long. Every minute is filled. Like their American counterparts, cadets are schooled in more than just military matters. Though Japan has historically been a closed society, Ichigaya today places an emphasis on languages, particularly those of strategic importance: German, Russian, English. They learn math and science not just as it applies to war, but as it applies to life. At the same time, they are taught their own military heritage. They are versed in jiu-jitsu, the incredibly effective Japanese hand-to-hand combat, and kendo, the kind of dummy sword fighting perfected by the samurai. Though the emphasis on tradition is never abandoned, as time passes, the cadets begin to study more modern military skills. All learning is by rote. The bending of individual will to the needs of the group is the basis of Japanese culture. In that sense, the Japanese have an advantage over the Allies. Japanese cadets don't need to be taught to follow orders. They do it instinctively. They react as one to commands. Eventually, all cadets must specialize. They learn the esoterica of artillery, engineering, the cavalry. The elite of the elite are drawn to aviation. Once those skills are mastered, training moves out into the real world. Huge mock battles are waged, and every cadet is taken on a tour of historic battlefields. The trips serve two purposes. They are, first of all, a lesson in the tactics of war. But as important, they are a reminder of the proud military heritage each cadet carries with him, of victories died for, and heroes who should not be forgotten. When they graduate, they do so in the presence of the Emperor. He presides, silent and unheard, over their passage into the sacred order his predecessors had decreed. Outstanding members of each class are honored, and the cadets embark on what are assumed to be long and significant military careers. That they will be significant is almost beyond doubt. With war raging across the Japanese Empire, there is little tolerance in the military for the ineffectual. But whether this year's class of graduates from Ichigaya Academy will have long careers is very much in doubt. Japanese losses are mounting, and their empire, while not yet shrinking, has ceased to expand. And as long feared by Japanese traditionalists, from distant shores there comes the promise that the war will not end until Japan's militarists have been eradicated from the face of the earth. September 1943, central Italy. At the base of Gran Sasso, a mountain in the Abruzzi region of Italy, a group of German commandos gleefully celebrate their successful execution of a raid known as Operation Oak. Happier still is the beneficiary of the mission, Il Duce himself, Benito Mussolini. Having been ousted as dictator by political maneuvering and royal proclamation on 23 July, Mussolini was taken prisoner 2 days later and has been held under close guard until his liberation today. Moved several times during his captivity in order to evade any German rescue attempt, Mussolini was finally taken to a dismal hotel at the top of the 9,000-foot Gran Sasso and told to make himself comfortable. The Italians deemed the location safe, because the only access was by cable car, and the control station at the foot of the mountain was heavily guarded. What they had not counted on was the daring and brilliance of Waffen-SS Captain Otto Skorzeny, who landed 80 commandos in 8 gliders near the peak of the mountain, while a second group battled to take the control station below. Despite being outnumbered nearly 2-to-1 by the Italian forces guarding the hotel, Skorzeny and his commandos were able to extract Il Duce without firing a shot. When the Italians saw the Germans charging up the hill, they hung a white bedsheet outside a window and handed the fallen fascist over without further ado. Now, along with Skorzeny, Mussolini boards a plane which will fly him to meet the man most responsible for his rescue, Adolf Hitler. Despite dissent, albeit muted dissent, among the Nazi hierarchy, Hitler had insisted on Mussolini's liberation. The relationship between the two men has always been more than political, and despite Il Duce's bumbling statesmanship and the Italian army's ineptitude, the Nazi leader holds his counterpart in high regard, for it was Mussolini's rise to power that Hitler used as a model for his own. In the 1920s, Mussolini founded the Fascist Party and, using the financial and social anarchy that plagued Italy as a springboard, catapulted himself to the top of the political heap. Hitler followed his lead and played the game perfectly, preying on the fears and hopes of a destitute Germany, using huge rallies, just as Mussolini had, to bolster the Nazi Party and gain control of the Reichstag. He maneuvered politically to convince President von Hindenburg to appoint him Chancellor and, on Hindenburg's death, seized complete control. While Hitler has certainly used his power in much more profound ways, it was Mussolini who blazed the trail, and the Nazi leader has never forgotten that. So it is that upon Il Duce's arrival in Rostenburg, Germany, on 15 September, the Führer is waiting, and the two greet each other with the warmth of friends reunited. They are joined by both Nazi and military leaders and enter into a series of meetings to decide how to restore Mussolini to power in Italy. But from the beginning of his visit, it is clear that this is not Il Duce of old. His eyes are that of a frightened child. He has clearly been overwhelmed by recent events and shows no signs of recovering the swagger and bombast that brought him to power. As the meetings conclude several days later, Mussolini boards a plane for Munich, where, in a radio broadcast, he will announce to the world the creation of a new government based in northern Italy and headed by himself. But in truth, he is incapable of running anything. It is Hitler and the Nazis who will call the shots for the newly created Salo Republic, with Mussolini purely a puppet of the German government. And so it is that Italy finds itself a nation torn asunder. With the Allies in charge in the south and the Nazis controlling the government in the north, Italy is occupied by two armies at war who are more concerned with serving their own purposes than protecting her best interests. It has become clear to all Italians that Il Duce, the leader, has led them down the road to defeat and ruin. September 1943, Funafuti Atoll. Marking the beginning of the Navy's long-anticipated Central Pacific drive, American B-24s take off to strike Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Island chain. With this being only the first of many scheduled attacks, commanders of the 11th Bomber Group intend to pound Japanese defenses on the island to dust. As the liberators approach the island, the few Japanese fighters that rise to challenge them are quickly chased off by Navy Hellcats, and the bombers go about their task unmolested. The bombardiers methodically home in on their targets, release their bombs, and, their work done, head for home. Upon returning to base, pictures made of the target area are sent to intelligence for damage assessment. What the analysts see is discouraging. The island is bristling with hardened Japanese fortifications, impervious to anything but a direct hit. Although some damage was done, Tarawa is far from out of action. This raid is the first step in what will be, if successful, the greatest naval operation in history, a grand sweep across the Pacific. Long championed by Admiral Ernest King, the operation has been the subject of often tempestuous debate between the American and British Joint Chiefs, as well as between the Navy and General Douglas MacArthur. The British, favoring an expansion of the Mediterranean front, fear King will sway General George Marshall and the American Joint Chiefs away from the Europe First strategy and divert a preponderance of men and supplies to the Pacific. MacArthur, believing it preordained that he defeat Japan with a swift drive through the Southwest Pacific, is aghast that King would dare interfere with destiny simply to garner acclaim for himself and the Navy. Although King has long pushed for an expansion of the Solomon Campaign into a larger Pacific offensive, only recently has that become feasible. The defeat of the wolf packs in the Atlantic, coupled with the rapid expansion of America's shipbuilding industry, has finally freed up the enormous number of ships necessary to launch the ambitious operation. These ships have been assembled into the new Fifth Fleet and placed under the command of Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance. With 6 new Essex-class fast carriers at his disposal, Spruance has devised a new combat tactic. Instead of each carrier operating in its own independent group, they will be grouped together with a single ring of escorts. Although this will limit flexibility, it will give U.S. commanders the concentrated air power necessary to support invasion troops across the vast Pacific. The fleet is divided into 3 commands: fast carrier forces, land-based aircraft, and last but not least, the amphibious assault force. Under the command of Rear Admiral Richmond Turner, the assault force has at its disposal a vast array of vessels, including everything from battleships to landing craft. Included in the mix is the new LVT, or Landing Vehicle Tracked. Better known as the Alligator, it is an amphibious tractor capable of ferrying troops across coral reefs that would rip conventional landing craft to shreds. These vehicles will be a crucial asset in assaults on the volcanic and coral atolls that dot the Central Pacific. Supporting this enormous force across such vast distances makes logistical planning a nightmare. To accomplish this daunting task, Vice Admiral William Calhoun has established a massive naval supply base at Funafuti Lagoon in the Ellis Islands. Here, enormous stockpiles of everything from aircraft parts to ice cream await shipment to the fleet. Tarawa and the Gilberts are but the first in a long list of islands that must be wrested from the Japanese before victory can be claimed. After the Gilberts, the more heavily defended Marshalls, Carolines, and Marianas await, and then the islands in Japan's home waters. How successful the Central Pacific drive will be waits to be seen, but naval commanders are optimistic, although they are aware that even the best laid plans can go tragically awry. The simple fact that they're capable of mounting such an offensive is indeed heartening. The U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet, which less than 2 years ago was nearly destroyed at Pearl Harbor, is about to take center stage in the fight for the Pacific. October 1943, England. The first of 291 American B-17s rolled down the runway, marking the beginning of an operation intended to inflict serious damage on the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt, Germany. This is the second raid on Schweinfurt by the U.S. 8th Air Force in less than a month. The previous mission, while reasonably successful as far as the delivery of bombs, did little to reduce the flow of ball bearings from the factories there. It is the hope of both the men who planned and the men flying this mission that it will be more effective than the last. It has been a bad week for the U.S. Army Air Force and the 8th Air Force in particular. The bombers have flown 3 missions in the last 7 days, and the resulting losses have been nothing short of disastrous. A mission to Bremen on 8 October resulted in the loss of 30 aircraft. 2 days later, a combined force of B-17s and B-24s returned from a raid on the cities of Danzig and Anklam with 28 fewer planes than when it set out. On the 12th, another 30 planes were lost in an attack against Munster. The reason for these stunning losses can be explained with one word: daylight. Unlike their British counterparts, the commanders of the 8th, at the behest of the Chief of the Army Air Forces, Lieutenant General Henry Hap Arnold, have scheduled their missions during the daytime rather than under the cover of darkness. The logic behind this strategy sounds not only reasonable, but downright clever. Daytime bombing is vastly more accurate, allowing for effective strikes against the military targets the Americans favor and reducing civilian casualties. In addition, with the British bombing at night, a 24-hour schedule makes it all the more difficult for the Luftwaffe to provide protection. What this tactic does not take into consideration are the limitations of both English and American fighters, none of which have a great enough range to escort the bombers all the way to and from targets deep in Germany. So, as the bombers reach Aachen, still a good 200 miles from their target, the P-47s, which have acted as a shield against the Me-109s and the Focke-Wulf 190s, must abandon the group because they haven't the fuel to continue. As the Thunderbolts turn and head for home, their pilots say a silent prayer and wish good luck to those they leave behind. Back at the base, those who await the bombers' return are uneasy. Everyone is aware of what has happened in the past week, and many are beginning to question whether even a B-17, a veritable beehive of 50 caliber machine guns, is capable of defending itself without fighter escorts. Contemplating the 400-mile round trip between Aachen and Schweinfurt the group must make before it can once again be joined by fighters, many are filled with a deep sense of dread. Meanwhile, in Schweinfurt, the damage is done. The B-17s have dropped more than 475 tons of bombs on the industrial center, and it will be some time before any ball bearings are manufactured here. However, as word of the destruction reaches Berlin, plans are swiftly put into motion to shift production to other areas. In addition, the Germans have enough ball bearings in reserve to keep assembly lines all over the Reich, churning out weapons and vehicles for months. Back in England, the bombers are beginning to return, and if the condition of the survivors is any indication, it was a difficult run. As the stragglers land and the debriefing of the crews begins, the awful truth becomes clear. Of the 291 bombers that embarked on the mission, 60 have not returned. Worse than the loss of planes is the human cost. 600 Americans are either held captive by the enemy or dead as the result of a single mission. It is almost too much to bear. And it is certainly too much to risk repeating. Brigadier General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, sends word to Washington that he is canceling all further unescorted daylight raids. The response is stunned agreement. With the previous 3 missions having resulted in the loss of nearly 900 crewmen, one wonders why someone didn't realize that this mission wasn't likely to fare any better. Why it took another 600 Americans captured or killed to make clear what should have been obvious. For the survivors of the mission and the men of the 8th, the decision seems to be too little, too late. In a country at war, there arises a social contract between those at home and those on the front. The civilian works to provide for the man on the line, who in turn fights to protect the peace at home. This establishes a natural boundary which reminds each of their responsibilities to the other. In this Second World War, many countries have seen this dividing line blurred as never before. One of the first nations to experience this was Great Britain. As the English learned during the first days of the Blitz, airplanes have changed forever the meaning of the word front. German bombers terrorized the British people throughout 1940 and 41, effectively moving the front well inside the shores of England. The parallel between the soldier in the field and the London dweller is made evident as every morning thousands of civilians stumble out of their subway shelters and into the dusty, rubble-strewn streets of their city, like soldiers climbing from their foxholes. In May of 1939, just months before declaring war on Germany, Britain began the process of drafting all its eligible young men into service. Many of those who were too old or too young, or those whose skills made them too important to be sent into battle, volunteered for duty in the Home Guard. Introduced by Prime Minister Winston Churchill to protect the English mainland in the absence of the army, these men patrolled the English coast and inland roads with nothing more than watchful eyes and outdated weapons. Since May 1942, every woman under the age of 50 has been required to register for service in the war effort. Many serve in the women's branches of the armed forces, but most go to work in factory jobs, replacing men gone to the lines. The most important way in which the average civilian is involved in the war is in his or her contribution to wartime production. While Germany built up its military might over the course of the 1930s, Britain was not nearly as well prepared and has had to produce war materials without respite, as there are no substantial stockpiles on which to rely. Following the example set by Winston Churchill, the people of the country have spent the last few years working with only victory in mind. 60-hour work weeks are the norm, standing in front of metal presses, hunched over sewing machines, performing tedious, repetitive factory jobs, pushing themselves so close to exhaustion that some people have actually been known to fall asleep at their stations. The British people understand that reduced consumption is just another kind of increased production, and abide by the rationing policy handed down by Minister of Food Lord Woolton. While they tolerate the reduction in eggs, meats, vegetables, and even their beloved tea, they are more resistant to Woolton's suggestion that whale blubber, soaked in vinegar, is a suitable substitute for more conventional meats. Rather, Britons simply eat less beef, pork, veal, and America's loathsome Lend-Lease spam. Instead, they consume as much chicken and rabbit as their overtime swollen salaries allow. Prime Minister Churchill has said, "The fronts are everywhere," that workers are soldiers with different weapons. In this war, as never before, the civilians of Britain know that even the streets of their hometowns can be shattered by their enemies. While the Home Guard cannot battle alongside Britain's soldiers, and factory workers cannot fire the weapons they build, all know that just like their sons on the lines, they too toil toward victory in the long shadow of Nazi Germany. First October 1943, the Italian front. The Allies at last enter Naples, the prize of Operation Avalanche. What they find is a smoldering, destroyed city with half of its population of 800,000 missing or murdered. Destroyed by the Nazis, this port town stands as a reflection of their barbaric legacy. As American Lieutenant General Mark Clark enters the city, he receives no hero's welcome. Neapolitan homes are tightly shuttered. All is desolate. After inflicting heavy casualties and holding the Americans up for nearly a week, the Nazis under General Wiedinghoff retreated from Salerno on 15 September. As the Germans withdrew, the Allies followed like dogs on the trail of a wounded rabbit. The clever Nazis, though, forced their enemy to detour, destroying every bridge and pass through the mountains. Allied infantry was made to forge through more hostile terrain, strewn with German mines and booby traps. Those soldiers the insidious devices didn't take as victims. A German rear guard tried to. Allied troops were trapped in the hills as the main body of Wiedinghoff's force marched into Naples. Neapolitans staged a heroic civil resistance, but were no match for the battle-trained soldiers. The Germans destroyed waterworks, food stores, and granaries, leaving the people whom they did not kill to starve slowly. At the pinnacle of savagery, they torched the ancient University of Naples, gleefully turning books into bonfires. When the Allies finally reached the plains of Naples, the Germans again retreated, but their presence is still felt. The port so desperately needed by the Allies is useless, littered with debris and sunken ships. On 7 October, a German time bomb explodes in the post office, killing 70. On 11 October, another bomb claims 18 paratroopers and wounds 56 others. As Clark's troops pursue the Nazis north, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring establishes a defensive line east to west along the ankle of the country in the Apennines mountain range, which is moated by the flooded Volturno River. On the evening of 12 October, the Allies utilized log rafts and Navy pontoons to ford the swelling river. When dawn comes, however, the Germans begin to pick off the soldiers one by one. On 13 October, under heavy fire, an additional 2 regiments forced their way across the Volturno and attacked the Germans. Wiedinghoff praises the Allied movement as powerfully executed. He can afford to be gracious. Most of his men are safely tucked into the crags and outcrops of the Apennines, practically untouchable by aerial bombardment. Kesselring, well known for his incessant smiling, can't help but grin at his strategy, which has stymied the Allies and depleted their ranks. All the Germans need to do is defend the 2 plains at either end of their 120-mile-long defensive line. Although they have lost a Confederate in the Italians, they still have a powerful ally in Mother Nature. The rugged Italian mountains, coupled with the onset of winter, bode well for the entrenched defenders. For the Allies, it means there is still a very long road to Rome. October 1943, Rome. In the capital city of Italy, the Italian government declares war on its former German sponsors and current occupiers. It is the latest in a series of moves that has left friend and enemy alike befuddled and openly mistrustful of the Italians. If there is a great satisfaction in soldiering, it is the retaking of occupied territory. There is nothing like the gratitude of a people liberated, the unbridled joy of streets finally free from fear, and the warmth of being a real-life hero. But as the Allies begin the long march up the Italian peninsula, there's something unsettling about the rapid Italian shift of loyalties, something indicative not only of their politics, but of their national character. The Allied doubts about the Italians go back to the decade before the war. As fascism ascended around the world, the Italians enthusiastically joined in, cheering Benito Mussolini as the supreme dictator of the new Italian empire. To the rest of the world, Mussolini looked like some kind of, well, clown. He dressed like a character out of a Marx Brothers movie, mugged like a ham actor, and promised his people a return to the glory days of ancient Rome. Of course, the Japanese and Germans were already taking over all the world's good parts, so the Italians had to make do with what was available, Ethiopia. You remember Ethiopia? Home of famine, pestilence, and a military barely evolved since the Stone Age. A less desirable conquest could barely be imagined. Still, the Italian people beamed with pride, convinced that Il Duce was delivering a new golden age. The Italians were firmly on the fascist bandwagon, and it was a grand celebration indeed when Adolf Hitler himself visited to proclaim the eternal binding of 2 great nations. Once the Allies awoke to the global menace posed by fascism, however, the whole tenor of the Italians' war began to change. In North Africa, the Allies swept across the desert, surprised at the lack of spunk demonstrated by the Italian army. Oh, the Italians fought most of the time, but not with the level of conviction one might expect from such an enthusiastic band of world conquerors. The Italians quickly descended from the pantheon of fascist supermen, becoming the object of ridicule not only by the Allies, but also by their Nazi compatriots. The Germans, calling the shots in North Africa, showed little confidence in their Latin buddies, tending to work around rather than with them. Still, it was with a certain amount of trepidation that the Allies approached Sicily. The conventional wisdom at the time was that when fighting for its native soil, the Italian war machine would get itself into gear. The Allies arrived, prepared for vicious house-to-house combat, on constant alert against everything from farmers with pitchforks, outraged at the presence of foreign invaders, to booby-trapped Lolitas. Instead, the Allies got a hero's welcome. The farmers brought out their freshest produce, and the Lolitas, while not precisely booby-trapped, were dangerous only in the way that Italian women have always been dangerous. While that delighted the soldiers in the short term, it didn't do much for the level of respect with which the Italians were held. Back in Rome, the government assured Der Fuhrer that it was steadfast in its loyalty to the fascist cause. Wary, the Nazis reinforced Sicily with their own troops, because despite the promises, Italian soldiers were falling all over themselves in their quest to surrender. Their welcome to the Allied troops rivaled anything any occupied people had ever done for their liberators, and none of the natives appeared even dimly aware of the irony that they were being liberated basically from themselves. Now, anyone can make a political mistake, and putting Mussolini in power would certainly qualify as just that. Still, there was something unseemly about the way the Italian people stopped being Hitler's friends and started professing their loyalty to the Allies. It was worse than the Vichy French, who, while generally perceived as gutless and two-faced, could nonetheless plead necessity. The Nazis had, after all, taken France over by force. The Italians, well, it's as if none of them remembered that they volunteered for the fascist cause. The old-timers on the lines, the students of history and veterans of earlier conflict, remember that the Italians pulled a similar reverse in the First World War. They sided initially with the Germans, who looked like history was theirs for the taking. But when the Allies came on strong, the Italians switched, siding suddenly with the French, English, and Americans. Anyway, now that the Allies are entrenched on the Italian mainland, they're getting used to their hosts. They accept the proffered wine of the farmer and the grateful kisses of Lolitas, and they're trying, really trying, not to snicker within earshot of their newfound friends. The Italians, for their part, are doing what they can for the war effort, teaching Allied soldiers the skills necessary to overrun their own country. Oh well, war makes strange bedfellows. On to Rome, and a greeting that will probably be as enthusiastic as it is perplexing. October 1943, the Russian front. While seasonal rains and the resulting oceans of mud have halted movement on both sides of the line in the north, soldiers fighting in the central and southern areas of the front continue to battle, with the Germans trying desperately to hold the line at the Dnieper River. German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commander of Army Group South, is urgently moving his reserves up to try and stave off the flow of Red Army troops pouring through a gap in the line near the city of Kremenchuk. In late September, von Manstein began to withdraw his men to a defensive line at the Dnieper, hoping to halt the advance of the Red Army, which had proceeded unchecked since the Russians recaptured Kharkov. But the Soviets, having finally shifted to the offensive after years of being beaten by the Nazis, were not about to allow their momentum to be hindered. They began their attack at 19 different points along the front in an effort to reach and cross the river before the Germans could dig themselves in. By the end of the month, they had succeeded, having crossed the river at 23 locations. Now, the Russians, having opened a gap in the line, are storming westward, But the Germans still have plenty of fight left. Von Manstein, realizing that the 1st Panzer Division is in danger of being surrounded, launches a counterattack. He strikes the advancing Soviet troops at their flank and rear. The ensuing battle is bloody and intense, with the Germans getting the better of the Russians. When the dust settles, 10,000 Red Army soldiers are dead. More important, their westward drive through the gap has been stymied. It does not take long for the Soviets to recover and regroup, however, and despite their victory, the Nazis cannot regain the upper hand. The Russians' attack on 28 October, followed quickly by assaults on 1st and 4th November. In each case, they managed to pound the Germans, forcing them to retreat. By 6 November, Soviet tanks are rumbling down the streets of Kiev, Russia's 3rd largest city. The Germans continue to fight, holding pockets around the city, but by sundown on 7 November, the Soviets are in complete control. When word of the victory reaches Moscow, Stalin is overjoyed. A planned festival marking the 26th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution will now serve a double purpose. A special order is issued, and the people of Moscow take to the streets to celebrate not just the anniversary of their government, but the flying of the hammer and sickle over communist headquarters in their beloved Kiev. (21 October 1943, Bougainville). In what has become a daily routine, American bombers and fighters pound Japanese installations on the island in preparation for the impending invasion. While the airfields at Buin in the south and Buka in the north are the primary targets of the raid, the pilots roam the skies looking for targets of opportunity. The continuous bombardment of the island over the past month has reduced the Japanese airfields to rubble. Pock-marked runways are lined with charred remnants of planes destroyed before ever leaving the ground. Those still intact are flown by green pilots who stand little chance against the Americans, who are seasoned veterans of the Solomon Air Campaign. Despite the constant harassment by American bombers, Lieutenant General Hiroyoshi Hyakutake and his vaunted 17th Army are dug in and well prepared for the invasion they know will come. Although Bougainville is the largest of the Solomon Islands, most of it is a swampy jungle. The only usable airfields are on the northern and southern coasts, and it is at those places that Hyakutake has established his defenses. This is precisely what Admiral Bull Halsey is counting on. Elated with the success of his island-hopping strategy, Halsey has no intention of butting heads with Hyakutake. Instead of launching an assault against the heavily defended airfields, the 3rd Marine Division is to go ashore at Cape Torokina on Empress Augusta Bay in the largely undefended middle of the island. Once ashore, they are to establish a beachhead, build their own airfield, and then just hold on. In order to hide the location of the main assault, there has been no pre-invasion bombardment of Torokina. The heavy raids on Buin and Buka have served to reinforce the Japanese assumption that the invasion will target the existing airfields. On 27 October, elements of the 2nd Marine Division contribute to the deception when they land on Choiseul, just off the southern coast of Bougainville. Although it is in fact just a raiding mission, Japanese commanders believe the landings are a precursor to the invasion and begin moving thousands of troops south to reinforce Choiseul. On the morning of 1st November, the 3rd Marine Division, under the command of General Alexander Vandergrift, goes ashore at Cape Torokina. Luckily for the Marines, the Japanese are caught completely by surprise. Guarding the beach are 18 well-camouflaged pillboxes that, fully manned, could wreck the landings. Halsey's deception, however, has worked so well that many of the positions are empty. Although they are too few in number to seriously contest the landings, the Japanese troops put up a tough fight. Despite heavy machine gun and mortar fire, the Marines press forward, determined to silence the Japanese guns. By 11 a.m., the last of the Japanese defenders are dispatched, and the Marines begin setting up anti-aircraft guns and constructing perimeter defenses. To the south, General Hyakutake faces a dilemma. He believes the landings are just a feint, and is content to let the Marines have their little piece of snake-infested jungle. His superiors, however, fear that they have once again been outwitted by Halsey, and order Hyakutake to send forces to Empress Augusta Bay to destroy the American beachhead. American commanders are cautiously optimistic. Although the matter is not yet decided, the beachhead at Torquena is firmly established and getting stronger every day. Construction of the airfield is now top priority. Once that is accomplished, the Japanese bases on the southern tip of Bougainville will be inconsequential. Once again, the strategy of jumping over Japanese strongholds to a less heavily defended objective has paid dividends. Not only has it saved countless American lives, it has Japanese military commanders in a state of confusion. They now face an enemy who not only has seemingly unlimited material resources, but one who refuses to play by their rules. In this war, as in all wars, the combatants, in addition to fighting one another, face an adversary that knows no battle lines, is completely unpredictable, never surrenders, and is more powerful than any armed force. The weather. Chief among nature's arsenal are rain and snow, and one or the other, sometimes both, inflict moist misery on soldiers and sailors in every theater of the war. A strong storm can cripple a fleet or stop an advancing army in its tracks. Persistent rain can do more to damage morale than defeat on the field of battle. But inevitably, the skies will clear and the order will be issued that it is time to move on. With the sun shining, timetables are issued that anticipate rapid advances and no delays. But what's this? Reports from the front indicate sloth-like movement and traffic tie-ups. Someone, it seems, has forgotten to explain to the fellows at HQ the concept of mud. Ah, mud. Whether from a torrential downpour, weeks of drizzle, or melting snowpack, all roads lead to mud, or perhaps we should say, all roads turn to mud. Our dictionary defines mud as sticky, soft, wet earth, or slanderous remarks. The soldiers who must march, drive, and live in it will be happy to provide their own definition, more than likely in terms that, if not slanderous, are uncomplimentary, to say the least. However you define it, it is a vicious viscous that has been known to swallow boots in a single gulp and topple the sturdiest vehicle. But the boys at HQ aren't interested in excuses. After all, why should a little mud hamper the movement of the greatest fighting force in history? Orders are orders, and so man and machine begin to move forward. And backward. And sideways. To November 1943, Bougainville, as the men of the 3rd Marine Division push inland to extend their beachhead, a convoy carrying 1,000 Japanese reinforcements and escorted by 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers is bearing down on Empress Augusta Bay. Alerted by coast watchers, Rear Admiral A.S. Merrill sends his outgunned force of 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers racing north to intercept the enemy before they can smash the tenuous beachhead. In the dark of night, Merrill spots the Japanese force and immediately attacks. The radar-controlled guns of the American cruisers let loose a deadly accurate salvo that smashes into the lead Japanese cruiser, blowing her into the night sky in an eruption of flames. The swiftness of the attack and the uncanny accuracy of the American gunners plunges the Japanese force into confusion. Amidst the chaos, 2 Rising Sun destroyers collide, attempting to avoid the curtain of shells raining down around them. After abruptly losing a heavy cruiser and a destroyer, the Japanese beat a quick retreat to the north. Although Merrill's masterly night fighting has saved the Marines at Empress Augusta Bay, the Japanese have no intention of giving in so easily. Determined to avenge the stinging defeat, Admiral Minichi Koga dispatches 6 heavy cruisers of the combined fleet to Rabaul to cover another reinforcement convoy. When aerial reconnaissance reports indicate the presence of the cruisers in Rabaul's Simpson Harbor, Admiral Bull Halsey faces the most desperate emergency he has yet confronted. He has no surface force capable of stopping such a powerful Japanese task force from sailing right into Empress Augusta Bay and wiping out the Marines. Halsey is compelled to make an agonizing decision. Although he lacks adequate surface escorts, he sends his 2 carriers, the Saratoga and the Independence, to launch airstrikes against Simpson Harbor. He confides in aides that he fully expects both air groups to be cut to pieces and both carriers stricken. On the morning of 5 November, under the cover of heavy weather, 96 strike planes roar off the decks of the American carriers. As they approach Rabaul, they face a heavy barrage of anti-aircraft fire, but inexplicably, the Japanese are slow to get interceptors aloft, and the Navy pilots roar in on their targets anchored in the harbor below. When the Japanese do get fighters into the air, they suffer mightily at the hands of the seasoned Americans. By the time the strike force turns for home, they have downed 25 Japanese planes and seriously damaged 6 cruisers and 4 destroyers. Believing the U.S. carriers must have formidable protection and unwilling to risk losing his heavy cruisers, Koga decides to withdraw them to the safety of Truk. Halsey's bold gamble is paid off. Meanwhile, on Bougainville, the Marines are fighting their way inland through the mercilessly thick jungle. Sweltering heat, torrential rains, and myriad biting insects are their constant companions. Maps of the island, distributed before the invasion, describe the terrain as damp flats. The running joke among the Marines is that it is damp up to your neck. Also fighting the damp environment are the Seabees. They are busy performing the engineering miracle of turning a swamp into an airfield. Night and day, they drain pools of stagnant water and clear rotting vegetation to make way for usable airstrips. It is tough work, but the can-do spirit of the Seabees is prevailing and progress is ahead of schedule. On 7 November, the Japanese land elements of the 17th Division just west of the American beachhead near the Koromakina River. The landings go unnoticed, and the Japanese attack catches the Marines off guard. Although they manage to break through the American lines in several places, the Japanese are quickly driven back by heavy machine gun and mortar fire. The Marines then open up with their heavy artillery, raining death and destruction down on the exposed Imperial troops. By the evening of 8 November, the entire Japanese force is virtually wiped out. Although they still face resistance inland, the threat of the Americans being driven into the sea has vanished. They are now firmly established on Bougainville and have no intention of leaving. In a little over a year, they have successfully climbed the Solomon Ladder, and once the airfield is complete, they can, in earnest, go about reducing Rabaul to rubble. November 1943, Italy. If Allied commanders didn't realize before, they certainly now know that Field Marshal Albert Kesselring completely controls Nazi operations in Italy. Without fanfare or change of strategy, Kesselring replaces General Heinrich von Wiedinghoff, who is on a leave of absence, with Lieutenant General Joachim Lemmelsen as commander of German ground forces. Unfortunately, the Allies are not so unified under a single vision. Coordination between Lieutenant General Mark Clark, who is maneuvering the troops on the eastern side of Italy, and British General Bernard Montgomery on the Adriatic coast barely exists. In fact, their armies appear to be fighting separate campaigns. As Montgomery's men have been inching inland, apparently to meet Clark, Clark's army has hardly advanced at all. Indeed, both in the east and the west in Italy, the Allies meander with continual offensives that tax their reserves of men and equipment, but make no real gains. In mid-October, the first Americans forged across the swollen Volturno River and headed north toward Rome. Blocking their way, however, were Kesselring's troops, firmly entrenched in the rocky Italian hills. At the start of the campaign, the German field marshal showed his commanders a map of southern Italy and pointed to each array of peaks within the Apennines Mountains. These ranges, he explained, would be the Nazi defenses. While the Nazis safely camped on the brows of the hills, Clark's troops pointlessly fired at their positions. The enemy, however, was unaffected and even downright disrespectful. They even waved and smiled at the frustrated Allies who futilely lobbed shell after shell at their mocking enemy, only to see the ammunition wasted. But the solid Barbara Line was forsaken by Wiedinghoff, who withdrew his troops north to yet another range of rocky mountains that established the Bernhardt-Gustav Line. Enraged, Kesselring publicly called Wiedinghoff a dummy. In his view, the withdrawal was premature and gave precious ground to the Allies without a fight. Wiedinghoff believed he was keeping to his commander's schedule and certainly didn't appreciate the name-calling he asked for and was granted to leave. In the meantime, Clark's troops pile into the Italian villages recently abandoned by the Germans. These towns, reduced to rubble by the Allied shelling, are now shelled anew by their former Nazi occupiers. Finally, in an attempt to break the deadlock, Clark orders his forces to take Mignano Gap, a tiny but treacherous section of Highway 6, the road that leads to Rome. The path zigzags up an extremely steep incline. At the top, entrenched and protected as always, are the Germans. Again and again, Allied infantry charge Mignano Gap and are repeatedly repelled. On 11 November, Clark's forces drive the Germans from a road adjoining Highway 6, but 2 days later, the Nazis answer that setback with a ferocious counterattack. All Allied personnel, including cooks and drivers, take up arms to defend the small road and, in a ghastly fight, hold it. While Clark's troops fight for the Roman road, Montgomery's 8th has pushed to the eastern portion of the Gustav Line. There, he calls for his units to halt so he can regroup and develop his next plan of attack. While the commander considers his options, Kesselring decides the east is no longer worth defending and orders his troops there to withdraw to the ever-important Roman road. The arrival of these reinforcements to Highway 6 is not enough for Lieutenant General Lemmelsen, who knows they are weary from battling the British. He requests that the fresh troops who are guarding Rome be moved south to the Mignano Gap. Before the request can be answered, the fury of the battle at Mignano turns to silence. Clark tells Army Group Commander Sir Harold Alexander that his troops are worn to the ground, and that even if they do take Mignano Gap, they probably wouldn't be able to hold it. Alexander agrees and a ceasefire is ordered. In 2 weeks, Allied commanders promise the push for the Bernhardt-Gustav Line will resume. Once German resistance is smashed, their armies will claim their prize and march victoriously through the streets of Rome. 23 November 1943, Cairo, Egypt. As the news cameras roll, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, along with their respective military chiefs of staff, put on their most diplomatic faces, displaying for all the world a unified front. However, behind the scenes, this is truly an uneasy alliance. From the very beginning, relations between the two groups have been at best cordial and at worst ill-tempered. The reasons for the conflict lie in a contrast of styles. The British, having lost staggering numbers of men in World War I by launching an endless series of headlong assaults against the Germans, are now forever in search of a way to avoid directly bumping heads with the Boche. The Yanks, on the other hand, are cocksure and confident that American industrial and military might are capable of crushing any foe, and are anxious, sometimes too anxious, to engage the enemy. The focal point of the clash has become the proposed cross-channel invasion, codenamed Operation Overlord. The English delegation, led by the persuasive oratory of Churchill, has time and again managed to delay implementation of the plan, all the while nodding in agreement. Originally intended to take place in 1942, the crafty Brits have managed to get the date pushed back to May of 1944. The Americans, led by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General George C. Marshall, have come prepared for a fight, and they get one. British Field Marshal Alan Brooke begins the conference by proposing the undertaking of campaigns in the south of France and the Balkans. Marshall, who sees this as another attempt to waylay plans for Overlord, responds with such fury that several of their colleagues worry that the two might come to blows. Subsequent discussions are only slightly less tempestuous. Joining the British and Americans in Cairo is Chinese leader Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, who has come to discuss the Allies' efforts to defeat the Japanese. Chiang, who is easily as crafty as the British, has garnered a reputation among the Allied leadership as a man more than willing to accept financial and material aid, but inclined to drag his feet when it comes to actually fighting the war. His propensity for accepting assistance has caused some among the Americans to tag him with the scornful moniker General Cash My Check. Chiang, however, is looking at the big picture. With the United States involved, he believes the defeat of Japan is inevitable. He knows that once the war is over, he will have Mao Zedong and the communists to contend with, and he has, perhaps wisely, already begun to fight that war. Churchill, who couldn't possibly be less concerned about operations in Asia, finds the negotiations with Chiang to be tedious, time-consuming, and trivial. His greater concern is what will take place when the conferees leave Chiang and Cairo behind and move to Tehran, where they will meet with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. It had been Churchill's hope to steer Roosevelt and the Americans away from their commitment to Overlord before meeting with Stalin, but as the conference in Cairo ends, there has been no change in their opinion. In fact, the Americans, having grown tired of following the dictates of the British, are determined not to be swayed under any circumstances. Shortly after the delegations arrive in Tehran on 28 November, things go from bad to worse for Churchill. Stalin, using rumors of an assassination attempt on Roosevelt as justification, invites him to stay at the Russian embassy compound where security is much tighter. Roosevelt agrees, and the two are soon engaged in a series of private meetings. Churchill, feeling as though the Soviets and the Americans are ganging up on him, begins to see his chances of putting the brakes on Overlord evaporating. Stalin has been demanding a cross-channel invasion from the inception of the three-way alliance. He insists that it is the only way to effectively divide Nazi military might and bring relief to the Red Army, who thus far has done most of the fighting and dying. Roosevelt, Marshall, and the rest of the U.S. delegation are in agreement with Stalin and are not about to let Churchill, Brooke, and their cronies cloud the issue. Still, the Prime Minister feels duty-bound to try, and while agreeing in principle with the idea of Overlord, continues to tout the advantages of an expanded Mediterranean campaign. On 29 November, the matter comes to a head when Stalin grows angry after another sales pitch for a campaign in the Balkans and icily demands to know whether or not the British are committed to Overlord. Churchill, knowing deep down that without the assistance of the United States and the Soviet Union, England would almost certainly fall prey to the Nazis, can do nothing but declare that it is Great Britain's stern duty to support and take part in a cross-channel invasion. The following day, the conference concludes with a celebration. It is Churchill's 69th birthday, but the PM is in no mood for a party. He is aware that in the last few days, his and his country's stature has been minimized. It was inevitable that the United States, whose industrial might is the key to defeating Germany, would assert itself. However, the fact that the Americans have chosen to align themselves with the Soviets means that the British, who until now have called the shots, will play not second, but third fiddle in the orchestration of the war. While the American foot soldier driving through Italy has had to fight tooth and nail for every inch of ground wrested from the Nazis, there are some comforts which help to ease the miseries inherent in war. Perhaps the greatest of these joys can be found in the faces of the enthusiastically grateful Italians. In many of the towns won by the Allies, citizens have poured into the streets celebrating their newly won freedom and the men who helped to win it. Although the GIs were greeted with similar adulation in liberated cities during the North African campaign, it is different here in Italy. In Africa, the soldiers found a culture quite different from their own. Italian culture, on the other hand, is woven into the very fabric of American society. Indeed, for many Italian Americans, the peaceful times between battles breed a feeling of homecoming. Many of these soldiers are actually permitted the opportunity to visit with relatives long missed or never seen. Further adding to the simple pleasures of Italy are the kids. The GIs, some just barely adults themselves, delight in playing with the young Italians. Men with families can see in the bright young eyes of Italy reflections of their own children back home. Time spent with these innocents soothes the soul and reminds the men what they're fighting to protect. While many things in Italy ring with familiarity, the fact remains that it is a foreign country and retains a certain alien quality. This is not offsetting, however. Rather, the cultural differences found here seem exotic and make certain citizens thoroughly alluring. Back on the line, many soldiers are working with reminders of home life in the form of mules. Thousands of these stubborn beasts of burden have been sent from America to carry supplies through the treacherous landscape of Italy. Joining the donkey is the ever-popular dog. Sickly strays roam the Italian countryside, and when they cross a GI's path, adoption attempts are inevitable. While Italy has involved some of the hardest fighting yet seen in this war, the rewards it offers to the men doing the fighting are more tangible than elsewhere. Cities are no longer mere abstract objectives on a general's map, but places that offer a mixture of the foreign and the familiar. And when the soldiers move on to their next objective, they march out, warmed by the memories of a land of friends, old and new.